Every morning, Atlas stood outside the old fire station before patrol. Nobody knew who he was waiting for, but the loyal German shepherd never missed a day. The first light of sunrise touched the quiet streets of the small American town as Caleb Rowe parked his truck near the community center. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine trees and fresh morning rain. Beside him walked Atlas, his trusted K9 companion, calm and focused as always. Most people knew Atlas as a gentle German shepherd with a remarkable sense of awareness. He walked beside Caleb during every morning patrol around the neighborhood, greeting familiar faces and watching over the quiet streets. But there was one place where Atlas always stopped: the old fire station at the corner of Maple Avenue. The building had been closed for years. Its faded red doors remained locked, and the old sign above the entrance showed years of weather and time. Yet every morning, before Caleb and Atlas continued their route, the dog would walk to the front steps and sit there. He never barked. He never scratched at the door. He simply waited. At first, Caleb thought it was just a habit. Dogs were creatures of routine. They remembered places, sounds, and familiar paths. "You like this old station, huh, buddy?" Caleb would say with a small smile. Atlas would look at him for a moment, then turn his eyes back toward the building. It was almost as if the German shepherd was listening for something only he could hear. For weeks, Caleb ignored the strange routine. He had known Atlas long enough to understand that dogs sometimes carried their own little mysteries. But one morning, something changed. As they reached the fire station, Atlas stopped earlier than usual. His ears lifted slightly. His eyes focused on the old brass bell hanging beside the entrance. Caleb followed his gaze. The bell had not been used in years. It moved gently in the morning breeze, creating a soft sound that disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Caleb looked at Atlas. The dog remained perfectly still. "What is it?" Caleb whispered. Atlas slowly looked back at him, then toward the bell again. For the first time, Caleb felt that this was not just a routine. It was a message. Later that day, Caleb asked some longtime residents about the old fire station. Most people remembered it as a place filled with history. They talked about the firefighters who once worked there and the community events that happened outside those doors. But when Caleb mentioned Atlas waiting there every morning, everyone became quiet. An older neighbor named Frank looked toward the closed station and said, "That dog has a reason for being there." Some places hold memories longer than people realize. Caleb thought about those words all afternoon. That evening, he looked through old photos of Atlas and remembered all the moments when the dog seemed to understand things before anyone else did. Atlas was never the loudest animal. He was never searching for attention. He simply noticed. The next morning, Caleb decided not to walk past the station. He would stop with Atlas. He would wait. The sun slowly rose above the rooftops as the two of them stood outside the old fire station together. And for the first time, Caleb wondered if Atlas had not been waiting for a place at all. Maybe he had been waiting for someone to remember. The next morning, Caleb Rowe arrived at the old fire station a few minutes earlier than usual. The streets were still quiet, and a soft morning fog covered the sidewalks around Maple Avenue. Atlas walked beside him with the same calm confidence he always carried. The German shepherd did not seem excited or distracted. He simply followed the familiar path that had become part of their daily routine. When they reached the old station, Atlas stopped at the front steps once again. Caleb stood beside him this time instead of continuing the patrol. He looked at the faded red doors, the weathered sign, and the brass bell hanging above the entrance. "What are you remembering here?" Caleb asked softly. Atlas looked toward the building. There was no answer, only silence. But somehow, that silence felt meaningful. Over the next several days, Caleb began paying closer attention. He noticed that Atlas always arrived at the same time every morning. He always stood in the same place. And he always looked toward the same corner of the old station. It was not random. It was a pattern. Caleb decided to learn more about the building's history. After finishing the morning patrol, he visited the town library and searched through old newspapers and community records. The pages carried stories from decades ago. They showed pictures of firefighters standing outside the station, families gathering during local events, and neighbors celebrating important moments together. The old fire station had once been the heart of the community. Then Caleb found something that caught his attention. A photograph from many years earlier showed a firefighter standing beside a German shepherd. The dog wore a simple canine collar and looked remarkably similar to Atlas. Caleb leaned closer to the photograph. The firefighter's hand rested gently on the dog's shoulder. Their connection was obvious, even through an old, faded image. Beneath the photograph was a short note. It mentioned a firefighter named Daniel who had worked at the station and a loyal K9 companion who stayed beside him during many years of service. Caleb looked at Atlas later that afternoon and wondered if there was a connection. Of course, he knew Atlas could not explain the past, but animals remembered in their own ways. They remembered places where they felt safe. They remembered voices, scents, and moments that mattered. The following morning, Caleb brought the old photograph with him. When they reached the station, he showed it to Atlas. The German shepherd looked at the picture, then back at the building. Caleb watched carefully. There was no dramatic reaction, no sudden movement, just a quiet moment between a man and his dog. Somehow, that made it feel even more important. Later that day, Caleb spoke with Frank, the neighbor who had mentioned the station's memories. Frank looked at the photograph and nodded slowly. Daniel loved that dog, he said. Everyone knew they belonged together. After the station closed, people thought that chapter was finished. Caleb looked toward Atlas. Do you think he remembers? Frank smiled gently. Maybe not the way we do. But some bonds do not disappear just because time passes. That evening, Caleb sat beside Atlas outside his home and looked at the old photograph again. He thought about the way Atlas waited every morning, the way he looked at the station, the way he seemed to carry a story nobody else knew. For the first time, Caleb stopped searching for a simple explanation. Maybe Atlas was not following a habit. Maybe he was honoring a memory. And somewhere inside that old fire station was a piece of the story that Atlas had been waiting to reveal. The old photograph stayed on Caleb Rowe's desk for several days. Every time he looked at it, he noticed something new. The faded image showed a firefighter named Daniel standing beside a German shepherd many years ago. The dog's posture was calm. The firefighter's expression was gentle. They looked like two friends who understood each other without needing words. Caleb kept wondering why Atlas waited outside the old fire station every morning. The more he learned, the more he felt there was a connection waiting to be discovered. One early morning, Caleb brought a copy of the photograph with him during patrol. As usual, Atlas walked toward the old station before continuing their route. The German shepherd stopped beneath the faded sign and looked toward the entrance. Caleb held up the picture. Is this what you remember? He asked softly. Atlas looked at the photograph, then toward the old doors. For a brief moment, Caleb felt the quiet weight of the moment. It was not about proving something. It was about understanding. Later that day, Caleb returned to the town library and searched deeper into the history of the station. He found articles about Daniel, the firefighter who had spent many years serving the community. People described him as someone who cared deeply about others. They also mentioned his K9 companion, a German shepherd who stayed beside him during daily routines around town. The dog had become a familiar face to everyone. But one detail caught Caleb's attention. After the fire station closed, Daniel moved away from the area. The records became unclear. The story simply stopped. Caleb wondered what happened afterward. Who cared for the dog? Where did the memories go? That evening, he visited Frank again. The older neighbor welcomed him with a warm smile and listened carefully. When Caleb showed him the photograph again, Frank became quiet. There was something special about Daniel and that dog, Frank said. They had a routine. Every morning, they walked past the station before starting their day. Caleb looked surprised. Every morning? Frank nodded. Same time, same path. Some habits are built from love, not just routine. Those words stayed with Caleb. The next morning, he followed Atlas more carefully. Instead of walking directly to the station, he watched every movement. Atlas stopped near a small side path behind the building. Caleb had never noticed it before. The path was covered with leaves and barely visible from the street. Atlas moved slowly along it, stopping near an old wooden bench hidden behind the station. Caleb walked closer. The bench looked worn, but someone had taken care of it over the years. A small metal plate was attached to the side. Caleb brushed away some dust and read the words engraved on it. For those who serve with loyalty and heart. He stood there quietly. The message was simple, but it felt connected to everything Atlas had been showing him. The dog sat beside the bench and looked toward the station. Caleb sat down next to him. For the first time, he realized Atlas was not simply returning to a place. He was following a memory that still mattered. The question was no longer why Atlas waited. The question was whose story he was still carrying. The old wooden bench behind the fire station became the place where Caleb Rowe spent more time than he expected. Each morning, after Atlas finished his quiet visit, they would sit there for a few minutes before continuing their patrol. The town continued moving around them, but that small corner felt different. It carried a sense of history, a feeling that something important had happened there long before Caleb arrived. The German shepherd always sat calmly beside the bench, looking toward the old station doors. Caleb began noticing small details he had ignored before. The faded marks on the ground where people once walked. The old photographs displayed inside the locked windows. The empty space where a fire truck used to stand. It was as if the entire building was holding onto memories. One afternoon, Caleb decided to ask the town fire department if anyone knew more about Daniel and his K9 companion. The current firefighters were younger and had never worked at the old station, but one of them remembered hearing stories from older members. A firefighter named Mike searched through archived records and found a small collection of documents that had been saved when the station closed. Inside was a handwritten note from Daniel. Caleb carefully read the faded words. It was not a report. It was not about work. It was a personal message about his friendship with his dog. Daniel wrote about the early morning walks they shared and how the German shepherd always seemed to know when someone needed encouragement. Caleb paused while reading those words. They sounded familiar. They sounded like Atlas. The same quiet understanding. The same ability to notice what others missed. Mike found another photograph inside the folder. It showed Daniel standing outside the station with his dog beside him. In the background was the same old bench. Caleb looked from the photograph to the bench outside the window. The connection was becoming clearer. That evening, Caleb returned to the station with Atlas. The sky was turning gold as the sun moved lower behind the buildings. Atlas walked directly toward the bench and sat down. Caleb followed and looked at the photograph again. "You knew this place before I did," he said softly. Atlas rested beside him. There was something peaceful about the moment. It did not feel like discovering a mystery. It felt like being invited into a memory. The next day, Caleb shared what he had learned with the community. People who remembered the old station began coming forward with their own stories. Some remembered Daniel's kindness. Others remembered seeing him walk with his German shepherd every morning. An older resident named Margaret brought a small box she had kept for years. Inside was an old fire station badge and a handwritten card. "Daniel gave this to me when the station closed," she explained. "He said places are not made special by walls. They are made special by the people and friends who fill them with memories." Caleb looked at Atlas as Margaret spoke those words. The dog was lying quietly beside him, just as he had done every morning. That evening, Caleb realized the old fire station was not only a place from the past. It was a reminder of something still alive. Loyalty, friendship, and the invisible connection between hearts that remain close, even when time moves on. But one question still remained in Caleb's mind. If Atlas was carrying Daniel's memory, who was he still waiting to see? The question stayed with Caleb Rowe long after the sun disappeared behind the old fire station. If Atlas was carrying a memory from the past, then who was the German shepherd still waiting for every morning? The answer felt close, but just beyond reach. The next day, Caleb arrived earlier than usual. The streets were still quiet, and the old station stood beneath the soft morning light. Atlas walked beside him as always, but this time the dog stopped near the wooden bench before reaching the front steps. Caleb noticed something different. Atlas was not looking at the station. He was looking toward the road. The German shepherd stood still, watching the empty street as if expecting someone to arrive. Caleb followed his gaze. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then an older woman slowly walked along the sidewalk carrying a small bag. Atlas lifted his head. The woman stopped when she saw the dog. Her expression changed from surprise to recognition. "That dog," she whispered. Caleb stepped closer. "Do you know him?" The woman looked at Atlas carefully. "Not him exactly," she said softly. "But he reminds me of someone I knew. Her name was Evelyn, and she had lived near the old fire station for more than 30 years. She told Caleb that Daniel, the firefighter from the old photographs, had a daughter named Claire. Claire grew up around the station and spent many mornings watching her father and his K9 companion walk through town. She loved that dog," Evelyn explained. Everyone knew they were close. Caleb listened carefully. "What happened to her?" Evelyn looked toward the old station. "After the station closed, Claire moved away. Life changed. People lost touch." Caleb looked at Atlas. The dog was sitting quietly beside him. There was no excitement, no confusion, just patience. Later that afternoon, Caleb searched through more records and discovered a possible address connected to Claire. He did not know if the information was still current, but he felt that Atlas had brought him this far for a reason. He wrote a letter explaining the old fire station, the photographs, and the dog who waited every morning. Then he waited. Days passed. Atlas continued his routine. Every sunrise, he stood outside the old station. Every morning, Caleb stood beside him. It became a quiet promise between them. Then, 1 week later, a letter arrived at the community center. Caleb opened it carefully. The handwriting was different from Daniel's old notes, but the words carried the same feeling. The letter was from Claire. She wrote that she had not visited the station in many years. She wrote that she still remembered the mornings she spent there with her father and his loyal K9 companion. She wrote that she never expected anyone to remember those moments. Caleb read the letter twice. Then he looked outside. Atlas was resting near the old station steps. The dog seemed peaceful, almost as if he already knew. Caleb understood then that Atlas had never been waiting for a place to change. He had been waiting for a story to continue. The next morning, Caleb received a message. Claire wanted to visit the old fire station. She wanted to see the place her father loved. She wanted to meet the dog who somehow carried a piece of that memory. Caleb looked at Atlas and smiled. After all these mornings, the answer was finally coming. The old station was about to welcome back someone it had been waiting for. The morning Claire returned to the old fire station arrived with a quiet feeling that Caleb Rowe could not explain. The streets of Maple Avenue were calm, and the early sunlight reflected softly against the faded red doors of the building that had carried so many memories. Atlas walked beside Caleb as they approached the station, just as he had done every morning before. But today felt different. The German Shepherd was not simply waiting. He was bringing someone back. A few minutes later, a car slowly pulled up near the sidewalk. An older woman stepped out and looked toward the station with careful eyes. Caleb knew immediately it was Claire. She stood still for a moment, taking in the sight of the old building, the brass bell, and the wooden bench behind the station. It was as if she was seeing a piece of her childhood return. Atlas noticed her before Caleb said anything. The dog lifted his head and watched her quietly. Claire took a few steps closer. "You look just like him," she whispered. Caleb watched as Atlas approached her slowly. There was no rush, no confusion, just a gentle connection between two beings who seemed to recognize something beyond words. Claire knelt beside Atlas and placed a hand on his fur. Her eyes filled with emotion as she looked toward the old station. "My father used to bring Max here every morning," she said. Caleb listened carefully as she shared memories that had been kept away for many years. She remembered waking up early and walking with her father before he started his day. She remembered sitting on the old bench while Max rested nearby. She remembered how her father always said a good friend never needed to speak to be understood. Caleb looked at Atlas. Those words felt familiar. They described the German Shepherd standing beside them perfectly. Claire walked through the station with Caleb and looked at the old photographs displayed inside. She stopped when she saw the picture of her father and Max. She touched the frame gently. "I thought these memories were gone," she said. Caleb shook his head. "Some memories just wait for the right person to find them again." Outside, Atlas sat near the old bench where Daniel and Max had once spent their mornings. Claire joined him and looked around the quiet area. She noticed the small details that had remained unchanged. The same path, the same tree, the same peaceful corner of the town. "I do not know how he knew," Claire said, looking at Atlas. Caleb smiled. "Neither do I." They both watched the dog resting beneath the morning light. There was no need for a perfect explanation. Sometimes loyalty was not something that could be measured or understood completely. Sometimes it was simply felt. Over the next few hours, Claire shared more stories about her father. She talked about his kindness, his patience, and the way he treated Max like family. Caleb realized that Atlas had not been searching for the past. He had been protecting a connection between generations. He had been keeping a promise alive. Before leaving, Claire placed a small flower beside the old bench. "Thank you for remembering," she whispered. Atlas looked toward the station one more time. Caleb stood beside him, finally understanding the truth. The old fire station was never just a building. It was a place where loyalty had left a mark. And Atlas had been returning there every morning, not because he was lost, but because some bonds are strong enough to guide us home. The days after Claire returned to the old fire station brought a new feeling to the small town. The building that had stood quietly for years was no longer just a reminder of the past. It had become a place where memories were shared again. Every morning, Caleb Rowe and Atlas continued their patrol through the neighborhood, but now people often stopped to greet them near the station. They wanted to see the German shepherd who had brought an old story back to life. Atlas remained the same. He never searched for attention. He never changed his calm nature. He still walked to the old fire station every morning and sat beneath the familiar sign. But now everyone understood why. Caleb noticed something beautiful happening around the town. People who had not spoken in years began sharing stories about Daniel, the old station, and the friendships built there. The fire station was becoming a place of connection again. One Saturday morning, the community gathered to clean the area around the building. They removed fallen leaves, repaired the old wooden bench, and carefully restored the small garden behind the station. Caleb watched as Atlas walked slowly between everyone, greeting each person with the same gentle patience he had always shown. Claire stood near the old bench holding a photograph of her father and Max. "He would have loved seeing this," she said. Caleb looked around at the people helping. "I think he already knew it would happen someday." Claire smiled. Maybe that is why Max trusted him. Caleb looked at Atlas. The thought stayed with him. The bond between people and animals was something he had always respected, but now he understood it differently. It was not only about companionship. It was about the memories they carried and the connections they helped create. Later that afternoon, the town decided to place a small display inside the old fire station. It included Daniel's photograph, a picture of Max, and a note explaining the importance of loyalty and friendship. They also added a picture of Atlas sitting outside the station, not because he replaced the past, but because he helped people remember it. A few weeks later, Caleb walked with Atlas during their morning patrol. As they reached the station, Atlas stopped at the usual spot. Caleb smiled. "Still keeping your promise?" he asked quietly. Atlas looked toward the old doors and then rested beside Caleb. The morning sun reflected across the building, making the faded paint look warm again. Caleb realized something important. Atlas had never been waiting for someone to arrive just once. He had been honoring a connection that deserved to continue. That afternoon, Claire visited again. She brought a small box that had belonged to her father. Inside was a collection of letters and notes from his years at the station. She wanted to share them with the community. As Caleb read through the memories, he found one sentence that felt familiar. Daniel had written, "The strongest friendships are the ones that remain, even when nobody is watching." Caleb looked outside at Atlas resting near the entrance. Those words described him perfectly. The German shepherd had spent every morning quietly protecting a story that many people had forgotten. He did not need recognition. He did not need anyone to understand him. He simply continued doing what his heart told him to do. As the sun began to set, Caleb sat beside Atlas near the old fire station. The mystery that once surrounded their mornings had disappeared, but something even more meaningful had taken its place. Understanding, gratitude, and the reminder that true loyalty does not fade with time. It waits patiently until the world is ready to remember. The old fire station was no longer a forgotten corner of Maple Avenue. Each morning, as the first light reached the streets, people could see the doors open, the garden cared for, and the familiar figure of Atlas sitting peacefully near the entrance. The German shepherd had become a quiet symbol of something the town almost lost. Not a symbol of the past, but a reminder that some memories deserve a place in the present. Caleb Rowe noticed how much had changed. Months earlier, he had been the only person wondering why Atlas stopped there every morning. Now, neighbors understood. They knew the story of Daniel and Max. They knew about the friendship that had lived inside those old walls. And they knew Atlas had carried that memory until someone was ready to listen. One morning, Caleb arrived at the station and found Claire already there. She was standing near the wooden bench, holding a small wooden box. "I found something else," she said with a gentle smile. Inside the box were old notes, photographs, and a small collection of memories from her father's years at the station. Caleb looked through them carefully. Each item told a simple story. A morning walk, a shared moment, a friendship built through years of trust. One photograph caught his attention. It showed Daniel sitting outside the station with Max beside him. Behind them was the same tree that still stood in the garden today. Time had changed many things, but not everything. The tree remained. The bench remained. And somehow, Atlas had found his way back to that same place. Later that week, the community decided to create a small memorial area inside the old station. It was not a large ceremony. It was not about making the past bigger than it was. It was simply about remembering. Families from the neighborhood came together. Children placed flowers near the bench. Older residents shared stories they had kept for years. Caleb stood with Atlas nearby and watched the town reconnect. He realized that the German Shepherd had done something extraordinary without making a sound. Atlas had brought people back to a place they had forgotten. He had reminded them of kindness, loyalty, and the importance of holding onto meaningful moments. As the weeks passed, Caleb continued the morning patrol with Atlas. Their routine remained almost exactly the same. They walked the same streets. They greeted the same neighbors. And every morning, Atlas still stopped outside the old fire station. But now Caleb understood. The stop was not about waiting for something to happen. It was about honoring something that already happened. One peaceful morning, Caleb sat beside Atlas near the station entrance. The town was beginning another day. Birds moved through the trees. The wind carried the scent of fresh grass, and the old brass bell reflected the sunlight above them. Caleb placed his hand gently on Atlas's collar. "You knew all along, didn't you?" he whispered. Atlas looked at him with calm, familiar eyes. Caleb smiled because he finally understood the lesson hidden inside every morning. Some stories are not found in books. Some are carried quietly by those who never forget. Atlas had carried a promise through time, and now the whole town carried it too. The old fire station was no longer a place people passed by. It had become a place where hearts remembered. The seasons slowly changed around the old fire station, but one thing remained the same. Every morning, Caleb Rowe and Atlas walked the quiet streets together. The German Shepherd moved with the same calm purpose he had always carried, stopping at the familiar place where so many memories had been waiting. But now, the old fire station was filled with life again. The once silent building had become a gathering place for the community. People came not because of the mystery anymore, but because they wanted to remember the kindness that had brought everyone together. Caleb often thought about the first morning when he stood beside Atlas, wondering why the dog refused to leave the old doors. Back then, he searched for answers. Now, he understood that some things were not meant to be solved quickly. Some things were meant to be felt. One early morning, Caleb arrived at the station and found Claire sitting beside the wooden bench. She was holding a small photograph of her father, and Max. Atlas rested beside her, peaceful and quiet. "My father always said that loyalty was a promise you kept even when nobody was watching," Claire said. Caleb looked at Atlas and smiled. I think Atlas understood that better than anyone. The three of them sat together beneath the morning sky. There was no need for many words. The old station, the bench, and the gentle sound of the brass bell carried everything they needed to remember. Later that day, the town held a small celebration to honor the history of the station. Families gathered, stories were shared, and the old photographs were displayed for everyone to see. Children listened as older residents explained how Daniel and Max had once walked these same streets. Caleb watched Atlas surrounded by people who once had no idea why the dog returned every morning. Now they knew. The German Shepherd had not been searching for attention. He had been protecting a memory. He had been keeping a connection alive until the right people found their way back. As evening arrived, Caleb walked with Atlas toward the station one last time before heading home. The sky turned golden above the rooftops, and the old building looked peaceful beneath the fading light. Atlas stopped near the entrance, just as he always did. Caleb stood beside him and looked at the place that had changed both of their lives. "You were never lost, were you?" Caleb whispered. Atlas looked up at him with gentle eyes. The answer was quiet, but Caleb already knew. Some journeys are not about finding a destination. They are about remembering where we belong. Years later, people would still tell the story of the old fire station and the German Shepherd who waited there every morning. They would tell how one dog helped the town remember a friendship that time almost covered. They would tell how Caleb learned that loyalty could survive beyond distance, beyond years, and beyond words. And every morning, when the sunlight touched the old red doors, Atlas would walk there with Caleb beside him. Not because he was waiting anymore, but because the place had become a reminder of something beautiful. A reminder that love, friendship, and loyalty leave traces behind. Some stories do not end when the mystery is solved. They continue quietly, in the hearts of those who remember.